get started. So let me introduce myself for those of you who I've not met. I'm Emily Liggett. I am a fellow board member and a member of NACD. And I have the pleasure of chairing this, what we call an NACD coffee cohort for ESG. And many of you have been part of that. This is still related to that subject. We are folks that care deeply about ESG and working with our companies and executive teams to understand best practices and where things might go and be very supportive in that effort. And we're willing to try some new things and talk about some controversial topics. So today is, so let me just do a little bit of housekeeping. So for those of you who've been on the call before, you may recall that we tend to keep the size small to 25 so we can have a lot of very open conversations. This time, because of the importance of this presentation, we've opened it up to a new group. So we welcome all the new faces. We typically do not record it and have Chatham House rules in effect. And you may have seen the recording started. This is for Josh's part only, as he will present the first 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll turn off the recording and have a lot of time for discussion and Q&A. So that's why that is a little bit different, but we want this to be a safe place to talk and really explore some complicated topics and topics that there aren't a lot of answers for yet, but just a lot of ideas. So we'll ask you to, as usual, to use the chat function or Q&A function to ask questions and just keep them coming as you think of them. Lisa and I will be trying to, put those together, get the ones that are most consistent first, and when Josh finishes, we'll have time for discussion. And then with Q&A, we will start using those that have come off the chat. And then hopefully we'll be able to allow you to ask from the phone to have time. So in order to save time, today we are not going to do our usual go around in introductions. So you received a list of the folks who have signed up. And so you'll have a little bit of idea of who's on the phone. Afterwards, we plan to send out notes from the meeting and some of the slides that Josh has used, so you can really fully engage in his presentation. So I think that's it. So I'm going to do a very short introduction of Josh. I know you saw a lot about him on the invitation, and it's a long and impressive CV. I'm not going to read that to you, but I'll say what I've been super impressed with Josh is he has both a right brain and a left brain, and he uses them both very effectively. So he has all this cyber IT, quantitative part of him, but he also has this, this human capital, thinking about organizations, change management, and people. And of course, we care a lot about that in general, but specifically for ESG and then the social part for sure. So I think this combination of all the trends happening with data and the quantitative, as well as the qualitative, and actually what makes sense in what we're trying to do, Josh has a really unique perspective. So I'm going to turn it over to Josh, and then we'll ask you to go on mute, and we'll take it from there. Thank you very much. Looking forward to it, Josh.
Thanks, Emily. I have to say that's the first time I've been introduced positively for having two halves of a brain. This is I'm not sure my wife would agree with that sentiment, but I'll roll with it. So I'm going to, as Emily mentioned, I'm going to spend the first 15 minutes or so just trying to walk through both some context around how I've been looking at and thinking around data, particularly human capital data as it pertains to ESG. I'm also going to talk about a couple case studies from a company around how you can use it in alternate ways, and then really try and tee up a discussion so that we can dig into it a little bit. My background, as Emily noted, is largely technology-based, and it's a really interesting time for technology now. So happy to let the conversation go wherever it needs to. So with that, let's see if I can share the correct screen. Can you all see the screen that says HC data and ESG? Oops.
Yes.
All right. So. And again, I'm going to just try and go really quickly through this. So feel free to hit any questions in the chat if you have them. So firstly, a little bit of context about how we got here. And again, this is to establish a framework for how we're looking at the problems. One of the ways that I look at how data is being used well and not well inside companies when it comes to human capital is that there's been a lot of changes. And inside companies, we've seen obviously a lot more data. At the same time, we're seeing a lot more churn. We're also seeing globally huge amounts of a lack of trust in institutions. In fact, we're now at a 70-year low in terms of trust in institutions. And we're also seeing a big drop in productivity. So when you look at what's happening inside of companies, it's not a pretty picture in terms of what we're getting out of our talent. And also, it's not a pretty picture in terms of their experience. When you look outside of the companies, you have something similar. You've got more risks than ever before, particularly around talent, in terms of having more distributed workforces. Obviously, there's been some changes around diversity, which are positive, but create additional pressures on the organization. There's inequality in terms of negotiation capabilities for different kinds of employees, and that's changing quickly. There's different kinds of risks that are at play, and obviously the markets are a really interesting and entertaining place right now for everybody. I think that's probably the nicest way to put that. So what does that mean about the problem that we're looking at? Well, again, just to split it in a couple different ways, the main problem as I see it is that we've been trying to deal with the issue of our human capital using the kind of metrics that we have had for a long time. And that can be like something as simple as your churn rate. Again, these are numbers that we've been collecting, or organizations have been collecting and managing with for a significant amount of time. We understand, generally speaking, the processes behind them. And yet at the same time, I'm not sure that they are as useful as some other metrics we could get, which are generally hard to manage. So stuff like behaviors or values or beliefs, these words themselves are sort of amorphous and fuzzy and don't lend themselves easily to quantitative analysis. And yet, I think that we can analyze them, and if we do, we're going to get much better results. Another way to look at the underlying problem is that human beings operate primarily in a psychosocial environment, not necessarily a heavily metriced one, and that environment requires trust. Right now, we have a significant lack of trust across the board. Compounding that, we have organizations that have more data than ever before and more analytic capacity than ever before. And so they're using that to try and extract more value from their human capital. Unfortunately, that's contrary to how human beings operate, i.e. requiring this trust. One of the examples of how this can be a real problem is around how driving with KPIs can escalate mediocrity, because it both removes or elevates the bottom quartile, but it also diminishes the top. Right? Because it removes opportunity for people to experiment, to be extraordinary, or to excel or exceed the bounds that those KPIs are designed to measure. And then lastly, one of the problems that we've seen a lot, and I'll get back to this in some of the case studies, is around how some of this more socially contextualized data around, again, behaviors or beliefs, it's really hard to deliver that stochastically. It's not something that you can do in an annual 360 review, even though that's the most predominant model. So again, another lens on the problem, it isn't that we don't have the data, it's more that we're using it the wrong way. So for example, if I were to wander around your house with a camera, you'd probably be pretty upset, not because you don't have people with cameras in your house, but because what the hell am I doing there, right? Why am I gathering all of this data? Similarly with employees, too much data can destroy trust because they're not sure why it's being gathered. Surveillance can often destroy trust, again, because it's removing autonomy. Driving solely from KPIs can remove trust because, again, it removes some of those opportunities for growth. Engagement data can, in some cases, destroy trust because employees feel like you're extracting information or insight from them, but it's not clear how that reverts to offer some value to them personally. And then lastly, attendance data, and I know that this is controversial. In many cases, we've seen that destroys trust also because people don't feel like they're being treated like adults. I would propose that what we need instead is data that helps employees feel like we trust them to do their jobs and to do their jobs to the best of their capacity as complete human beings. And again, that gets down to some of the ways that the highly metriced KPIs are driving some employee behaviors. Similarly, I think we need more data that helps employees grow and develop, again, within that frame, that psychosocial frame of being complete human beings. And that one example that I like to use is that we are not designed solely to screw toothpaste tube caps onto toothpaste tubes. And when we are limited to doing so, we get to be unhappy very quickly. And then lastly, we need to be able to promote and demote based on these behaviors. And again, I'll speak more about this in the case study, but I think that where that's pointing is that it's not just about elevating people who are behaving at best, but also figuring out where there is actual alignment from some much deeper drivers earlier on in the value cycle from an employee perspective. Now, not surprisingly, this is hard to do. Some of the things you need are real authenticity, you need vulnerability, you need to be continuously available. And all of this is harder now than ever before, not least because of the fact that we have very distributed workforces, or much more distributed workforces. On the other hand, I think that the upsides are really significant. So what the heck do I mean by all of this? In order to explain that, I want to talk through a couple of case studies from a company that I've founded that really illustrates, or I'm hoping will illustrate, some of the differences around how data can be used well and how it can be used badly. And then hopefully that'll help frame up a discussion about where it's going to. So the first of those is around a big European telecoms company. It's one of those companies that has a whole lot of support personnel. Call centers is probably a really good example. One of the problems that this company had is that they were nailing the product, they were nailing the market, there was huge demand, but they just weren't generating good profits because they had such high churn. Now, one of the interesting aspects of this, if you look at the chart on the top, you'll see that non-managers, their tenure was down to 10 months and falling fast when we first engaged with them. Interestingly, and no one else was measuring this when we started, the average tenure of managers was going up. So what they were doing was they were quite aware that they had, again, the right product, right market, everything was good except for their support personnel. So what they did was they started basically turning the screws on their KPIs. So they more closely linked remuneration to those KPIs. They started creating groups of employees and forcing them to compete against those KPIs. They started minimizing any downtime that was available so that people were constantly going from one call to another. When that didn't work, they started tracking movement on screens, so how your mouse was moving. And if it was moving too slowly, then they'd call you in for an intervention. Then they brought in additional software to make sure that people had less time when they weren't actively working. And the outcome of all of this is that essentially churn and burnout increased. So they started losing more people more quickly. Now, again, manager tenure continued to increase during this time. So when we came in, we took a very different approach. And this, again, I bring this up because I think it characterizes a different attitude around ways to measure human capital data. When we engaged with them, we started with a bunch of interviews with people who were leading in those different divisions to figure out what the behaviors were, or what the human soft skills were that were correlated to those KPI outcomes. We then did a number of tests to figure out which of those skills were actually correlated with those outcomes. So for example, conversation skills were strongly related to first-time resolution rates. Then, to get back to the data side, we did a bunch of multivariate testing to figure out what methods actually improved those skills as evinced by improvements in those KPIs. So again, rather than just throwing up a whole bunch of L&D at the whole company, we started figuring out that in some cases, expert-led training was very effective. In others, it was mostly social learning. And as those numbers started to go up, management was more comfortable in building in a little more personal development time for those employees, but it was dynamic. So rather than saying, all right, every Friday you get 4 hours to go do this, it was much more intermittent. So look, you've had a bunch of calls back to back. Why don't you take a 10-minute break, and here's a short piece of learning around something that you have been trying to develop yourself. So it was highly personalized. And then you can see that the numbers reflected that improved. Now, most interestingly, while the non-manager churn started decreasing, manager churn started increasing as a result of these interventions. And the firsthand accounts that we got from leadership was that this happened because all of a sudden people started having a framework for speaking about success. So it went from my KPI versus your KPI to how are your conversation skills? And they discovered that there was a significant gap in terms of those managers, mostly mid-level managers, who were putting in more and more of these surveillance systems, but weren't getting the results. So takeaways here. One of the big things that I think is worthy of discussion here when I'm done with this deck is My experience has been that these human skills actually do correlate nicely to KPIs. And again, I recognize that they're much further upstream, but we were able to do a strong correlation from things like conversation skills, reversing a decline in those first time resolution rates. Similarly, we actually increased churn in management, but that turned out to be a really good thing because it meant that they were keeping the talent that they needed and losing the talent that they didn't. Thirdly, the heavy surveillance wasn't actually giving them the efficiency they wanted. And then lastly, there's no training that was universally applicable, and being highly personalized and dynamic about it actually really produced good returns. So that's the first case study. The second one, it's much a very different kind of characterization of the issue. This is much more around a very large company that had a CEO who staked his claim on the company around being ethical and around an ethical approach. Unfortunately, some of his employees made a decision focused on profit instead of that, and he lost his job. So then the next CEO came in, and obviously the big question was, how do I make sure this doesn't happen to me? The result, or the approach that they took, was to use engagement data. And we all know about engagement data. It's been around for quite a long time. They started doing regular engagement surveys. They had another issue where there was a profit versus ethics, for however it is that they define that internally, happened. They then increased the frequency, so they were then doing weekly pulse engagement surveys. They had another incident. Then they started doing specific spot checks to ask people. And throughout all of this, everyone said that they were very engaged and very happy with the company and very much aligned with all of the ethics of the organization. And yet it was clear that they were just parroting the talk from the top. No one was actually buying it. So again, we came in and started measuring actions instead of sentiment, which I think is a real key takeaway from this around the kinds of data that you can be monitoring now as opposed to in the past. So instead of just engagement rates or sentiment analysis, we were able to see what were people actually doing. That then helped people understand whether the communications that were being distributed were having an impact. And they were able to start shifting to a more of a social learning platform to make sure that that impact was being delivered, or that messaging was being delivered in a way that actually did produce impact. A big key element of that was that they had people who were leading in evincing those kinds of behaviors within the organization, not just outside experts. And that resonated quite a bit more. Then lastly, we made sure that data was really granular, it was attributable, and that allowed them to start really promoting people based on those behaviors, which was much more intuitive and easy to understand because it was something that was actually observable amongst groups of peers instead of something that was just put on the wall and said, okay, we all need to adhere to that. Takeaways here, again, action behavior data can be very, very valuable, in some cases more valuable than sentiment. Again, we've seen that this behavior data actually can be a solid measure of ROI, particularly for things like comms or training, where there may not be as strong of a through line to those end KPIs. One of the other things that we found was that the maximum improvement really did require a fairly quick turnaround, iterative, and highly contextualized feedback loop. And then lastly, sentiment's not going to protect you from forced resignation because it's something that is really hard to validate from employees. So what next? Well, really the big takeaway here is that we've got a lot of data, we've got a lot of analytic capacity, we've got a lot of technology, we have all of the tools, but we're also dealing with an extremely dynamic, uncertain, and in some cases totally illogical landscape. And we have all seen just in the last week or so some pretty good examples of that. So what next? And that's what I'm hoping to have a discussion with you all about. So I'm going to close this screen because I can't actually see you, and it's very even more awkward than usual to do that. And where are you? There we go.